If you're pruning your tomato plants the way most gardening advice tells you to, you may already be making a mistake that's quietly reducing your harvest. And the worst part? You probably won't see the damage for weeks. Watch closely the next time you make a heavy prune. A clear droplet forms on the fresh cut, then another. Within hours, sap is pooling and dripping from the severed stem. Most gardeners reach the same conclusion. The plant is bleeding. The plant is stressed. The wound needs to be sealed. That belief has been passed from gardener to gardener for generations. In fact, it traces back to a pruning mistake that has survived for more than 400 years. And it may still be costing tomato growers part of their harvest today. But modern plant science reveals something surprising. The sap is usually not the danger, and the product most gardeners reach for to stop it may actually create more decay than doing nothing at all. A landmark 13-year investigation into plant wound response found that many pruning sealants trapped moisture against damaged tissue, creating ideal conditions for harmful pathogens. More surprising still, the same 400-year-old pruning mistake still taught today can quietly reduce root development by up to 18% and delay harvest by nearly 2 weeks. By the time you notice the difference, the decision that caused it may already be a month old. Today, you'll discover why that dripping sap is not the real threat, what the plant is actually doing after a cut, and why one of the most common pruning beliefs in gardening may be quietly sabotaging your tomato harvest. The strange part is that gardeners have been trying to solve this bleeding problem for centuries, and almost everyone was taught the same solution. Cover the wound, seal the cut, protect the plant. It sounds completely logical. After all, if a wound on a person needs protection, surely a wound on a plant does too. That single assumption survived for more than 400 years, and it helped create an entire market of pruning paints, grafting waxes, and wound sealants designed to stop a problem many gardeners never fully understood. But researchers eventually discovered something surprising. The cut itself was often not the real problem. In many cases, the treatment created its own risks. Long-term arborist research challenged the idea that every wound needed to be sealed. A growing body of evidence showed that some sealants trapped moisture against damaged tissue and created ideal conditions for decay-causing organisms. In other words, generations of gardeners may have been trying to protect plants from the wrong threat. And that brings us to the detail that changes everything. That frightening sap dripping from a fresh cut is often not evidence of a plant in crisis. It can be evidence that an internal system is still working exactly as it should. Which raises a much bigger question. If the sap isn't the danger, what is the plant actually doing after a cut? Because the answer begins with a hidden biological system most gardeners never see. To understand why this 400-year-old pruning mistake survived for so long, you first have to understand what most gardeners never see. The moment a tomato stem is cut, the real story is happening inside the plant. The first misconception is that dripping sap means the plant is losing a battle. In many cases, the opposite is true. That clear fluid is often evidence of root pressure, a hidden transport system working beneath the soil, long before the cut was ever made. Deep underground, roots pull mineral nutrients into the plant. Water follows through osmosis, creating pressure that pushes moisture upward through the stem. When the stem is cut, that pressure can appear as visible sap. What looks alarming is often evidence that the system is still functioning. But that is not the most important discovery. For generations, gardeners were taught to think about plant wounds the same way they think about human wounds. A wound appears, a bandage goes on, problem solved. Plants do not work that way. Modern plant pathology has revealed that plants build protective barriers around damaged tissue and limit the spread of decay. And what happens next is even more remarkable. Within seconds of a cut, the plant launches a defense response. Calcium signals surge through tissues. Electrical warning signals move beyond the wound itself and begin alerting other parts of the plant. Before most gardeners have even set down the pruning shears, the plant has already started responding. But here is the detail almost nobody talks about. None of these defense systems matter if the cut is made at the wrong time. According to university field trials, that timing mistake can reduce root development by 18% and delay harvest by nearly 2 weeks. Most gardeners spend years worrying about what to put on a pruning wound. The real damage may have begun before the blade ever touched the plant. Most gardeners never notice this mistake because the damage happens in the one place they rarely look: underground. That is what makes it so expensive. If a pruning mistake turned leaves yellow overnight, nobody would repeat it. But according to university field trials, this mistake hides itself so well that many gardeners spend an entire season blaming the wrong cause. The plant often looks completely healthy, while the real consequence develops beneath the soil. The mistake begins when a healthy tomato plant starts producing vigorous new growth and looks overcrowded. So the gardener follows advice that has been repeated for generations. Prune early, direct the energy, encourage a bigger harvest later. It sounds logical. Researchers discovered something surprising. When pruning occurs before the first flower clusters open, root development can be reduced by as much as 18%, while harvest may be delayed by nearly 2 weeks. The shocking part is when gardeners finally notice the result. By the time the harvest difference becomes obvious, the decision that caused it may have happened more than a month earlier. Most gardeners never connect the two events, blaming weather, fertilizer, genetics, or bad luck instead. Few ever suspect a pruning cut made weeks before, and that hidden cause and effect relationship is exactly why this 400-year-old pruning mistake survived. Gardeners saw weaker harvests but rarely connected them to the original cut, so the advice kept spreading. The plant keeps growing, but with a smaller underground engine that affects every future tomato it produces. But the next discovery is even more surprising, because not every tomato plant responds to pruning the same way. For some varieties, removing the wrong sucker doesn't reduce harvest. It permanently removes fruit that would have existed. Imagine two gardeners standing beside identical tomato plants. Both see a sucker growing between the main stem and a leaf branch. Both have heard the same advice: remove it, it steals energy. So both gardeners make the cut. Weeks later, something strange happens. One gardener notices no difference. The other unknowingly removed fruit that plant would have produced later in the season. Not reduced it, not delayed it, removed it completely. And most gardeners never realize it happened. The plant continues growing normally. The missing harvest simply never appears. This is one of the most misunderstood pruning mistakes in gardening. And it survives for the same reason as the 400-year pruning myth. The consequence is delayed. By the time the harvest is small, few people connect it to a decision made weeks earlier. What most gardening books fail to explain is that not every tomato plant responds to pruning the same way. For some varieties, removing a sucker may have little impact. For others, university extension research and field observations have shown that those secondary growing points go on to produce additional flower clusters and fruit. In other words, that sucker is not stealing tomatoes. It is becoming tomatoes, and once it is removed, that future harvest is gone forever. The advice is often being applied to the wrong plant. But even gardeners who get this right often make another mistake immediately after pruning. And what happens during the first 24 hours after the cut can determine everything that happens next. Most gardeners think the critical decision is whether to prune. It isn't. The bigger mistake often happens after the cut. The moment gardeners see sap on a fresh wound, they assume the plant needs help. A sealant, a barrier, something to stop the damage. It feels logical. But this is where a centuries-old gardening myth collides with modern plant science, because the plant is already responding before the gardener decides what to do. Researchers discovered something most gardeners never hear. Within seconds of a pruning cut, the tomato plant launches a defense response. Calcium signals surge through its tissues. Electrical warning signals move beyond the wound and begin alerting other parts of the plant. Think about that. Before most gardeners have even set down their pruning shears, the plant has already detected the injury and started responding. That is the part gardening books rarely explain. The plant has already begun responding on its own. If the plant has already recognized the wound and activated its defenses, what exactly is the sealant accomplishing? Long-term arborist research repeatedly challenged the idea that every wound must be covered. The gardener is reacting to a problem the plant has already begun solving. And here's the part that takes even longer to show up. If that sealant traps moisture against the wound, the decay may not appear for weeks or even months. By the time it does, few gardeners connect it to the product they applied earlier in the season. And that leads directly to the discovery that surprised researchers most. Because one simple action over the next few days can help recovery far more than many commercial pruning products ever could. So what should you actually do after pruning? Usually less than you think. Skip the sealants. Avoid unnecessary stress. Keep the soil consistently moist. Then let the plant do what it has been doing successfully for millions of years. Researchers found that within seconds of pruning cut, electrical and chemical warning signals were already moving through the plant. In other words, the plant was already responding long before the gardener reacted. And that is the lesson most gardeners never learn. The sap was never the real danger. The sucker was not always wasted. The plant was never helpless. The real problem was a 400-year-old misunderstanding that convinced generations of gardeners they needed to outsmart a system they didn't fully understand. The tomato plant was never broken. So if you've been making this mistake, it isn't because you weren't paying attention. The advice itself was wrong, and it had already been passed from gardener to gardener for centuries before you ever picked up a pair of pruning shears. The gardener's understanding was, and sometimes the smartest thing you can do is get out of the plant's way.